In this lecture, we're going to zoom in on uniform initialization when we are initializing aggregates. And uniform initialization really refers to the fact that we can initialize anything in C++ either using parentheses like this or curly braces. We have mostly seen that we can use the parentheses syntax to set up objects in C++, and we could pass parameters to our object, and the C++ compiler would see this and call our constructor to set up our object. But we can also use curly braces if we want to do that as part of uniform initialization in C++. Uniform initialization is something that was introduced in C++ 11, and we can still use that in C++ 20. But now we want to see how this works with aggregates. We have seen that we already know about two examples of aggregates so far in this course. We know about struct and we know about array. Here we have an example of a person struct which has two member variables. The first one is an std string and the second one is an integer. So we can initialize that using curly braces like this. But it is also possible to initialize our aggregates using the syntax that uses parentheses like this. So these things are going to be mostly similar, but the main difference I have found is that if you initialize with curly braces, you're not going to be allowed to do narrowing conversions. And if you use parentheses to initialize your aggregates, you're going to be allowed to use narrowing conversions. Except for that, I think these two kinds of initializations are the same. It's going to be a matter of preference. But other than that, these two ways of initializing your objects are going to be working exactly in the same way. Now that we know this, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is uniform initialization for aggregates. We're going to grab our template files pretty quick and we're going to put them in place. After that, we're going to open this little guy in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. And this is going to open our folder and we should have our main CPP file here. Let's crack it open. And the first thing I want to do is to show you that we can use uniform initialization even for the objects we build ourselves. So let's set up a simple class. We're going to set up a class called point. It's going to be having two sections, a public section and a private section. We're going to have our constructor, which is really simple. It's going to take two parameters by value. It's going to be using an initializer list. And you see that we can even use curly braces in our initializer list. So this is going to work. C++ is going to accept this. Or I should say, C++ compilers are going to accept this. Once we have initialized our little guys, we're going to hit the body of the constructor, and we're going to say that we have called this constructor. What I really want you to see is that we can go down in main and create point objects using uniform initialization. We're going to say point P1, and you already know that we can pass our parameters, for example, like this. And this is going to work. Okay, so let's make sure we are passing in double parameters, or arguments, I should say. And this is going to work. If we print this point, we're going to see the information. So let's build and really show you that the compiler is going to accept this and the build is going to be good. Another thing you should know is that you can use curly braces and the compiler is going to know that if it sees a syntax like this, it's going to call your constructor. So let's build and show you that the constructor is going to be called, and it is going to be our constructor here, which takes two parameters. You see the build is good. We can clear and run rooster. We're going to see that point constructor is called. Our constructor is going to be called regardless of the uniform initialization syntax you use. We can either use curly braces or parentheses. This will work. Let's say uniform initialization, and this can be parentheses or curly braces. Either of this is going to work, and it is going to call the constructor that you have in place. But what we really want to look at in this lecture is uniform initialization in the context of aggregates. And we're going to use a struct and an array to really drive the point home. We're going to go down and set up another struct, which is going to be a person struct. And suppose inside we're going to put in some data. We're going to put in an std string, which is going to store the name for the person, and we're going to put in an unassigned integer. We're going to say unsigned int age, and we forgot to put the variable name, and we forgot to put the variable name for the std string member variable here. My bad. We're going to say mname, and we're going to say mage here to really be super clear that it is a member variable. I like to use this syntax. And now Visual Studio Code should be happy about this. At least I hope. Let's build again to really make sure that this is valid syntax. You see the build is good. We can set up our struct like this. But what we really want to see is that we can use either curly braces or parentheses to initialize our aggregate. Let's go down and do that. We're going to say that we are trying to use our struct, and we're going to use our curly brace syntax, and we're going to see what we can achieve with this. So we're going to set up a person object, and we're going to say person1, and we're going to use curly braces. What we're going to do is pass in the name, let's say Daniel, and we're going to pass in the age, and let's put in 35. And if we do this, you see that the syntax here is going to work. Let's try and build to really prove this. Okay, the build is good, but if we try and use, for example, double for the age, let's see what we get. Let's try and build and see that we see what is wrong here. We're going to see that we're going to have a compiler error. And you're going to see that the error is narrowing conversion from double to unsigned int. The problem is narrowing conversions are not allowed if you are using uniform initialization and initializing an aggregate with curly braces. This is not supported. If you do this, you're going to get a compiler error. The reason has to do with how the compiler wires these things up behind the curtains. We're not going to go into those details. For now, it's going to be enough to know that narrowing conversions are not going to work if you're trying to use uniform initialization with curlies for your aggregates. Let's turn this back to 35, and you're going to see that this is going to be accepted by the compiler. We're going to go down and look at how we can use parentheses and see if this actually works. So we're going to say parentheses here, and we're going to comment out the person object we just created here, and we're going to create another person object. Let's do that. We're going to say person, and we're going to say P2, and we're going to use parentheses and pass in the same kind of data. We're going to pass in Daniel, or we can use John. I am tired of Daniel. And we can say John is 41 years old. You're going to see that this is going to be accepted by the compiler. And if we're trying to build, this is going to build fine. Let's pass this through GCC and make sure that the build is good. And a benefit with parentheses like this is that narrowing conversions are going to be allowed. So if, for example, we pass in 41.7 for the age, we're going to see that we're not going to get any squiggly line. But even if we build, this is going to build successfully, because with parentheses like this, narrowing conversions are going to be allowed if you use this to initialize your aggregate. So this is really the difference between uniform initialization for aggregates using curlies and parentheses. With curlies, the narrowing conversions are not going to be allowed, but with parentheses, narrowing conversions are going to be allowed. Other than this, I think these two ways of initializing your aggregates are really the same. And again, these curlies and parentheses are part of a bigger scheme in C++ to do uniform initialization on anything. The idea is that we should be able to use parenth or curlies to initialize anything in C++. Okay, so we have seen that this syntax is going to work for a struct, which is one example of an aggregate we know about, but we can also use this for arrays. So for example, if we set up an array for students and say it is an int array and initialize this using curlies, we only can use integers inside here because we don't support narrowing conversions if we use curly braces. If we do this, you're going to see that this is going to build fine. Okay, bold is good. But if we change one of these guys to a double, for example, we're going to have a compiler error because we just put in something that is going to call for a narrowing conversion from double to int. This is going to give us a compiler error because we can't do narrowing conversion from aggregates if we initialize with curly braces. If we want to use narrowing conversions, we can change this to parentheses, and this is going to work. And I don't think I have shown you that we can initialize our array like this, but this is going to work. This is going to initialize your array, but in this case, the 4.7 here is going to be implicitly converted to int because this is an array of ints. If we build, we're going to see that the compiler error is going to go away. We are going to build good, and this is what we want. This is really all I had to share in this lecture. I hope you found it interesting. For now, we're going to head over to the next lecture and try to recap what we saw in this chapter. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.